Welcome back for another deep dive. Ready to explore some more history with me today?
Always excited to dive in.
Awesome. So today we're going to take a closer look at the history of industrialization,
Okay.
specifically the rise of factories and their impact on workers.
Hmm.
You know, it's funny, we often think about this grand sweep of progress, right?
Yeah.
But what about the everyday lives of those caught up in these huge changes?
Exactly.
Like, what was it actually like to be a worker during the Industrial Revolution?
Right.
So much to unpack,
It's a big topic.
definitely. And that iconic dawn-of-the-century image with the angel figure soaring over factories and railroads,
Yeah.
it captures that sense of technological advancement, don't you think?
It does. It's a very powerful image.
But I'm curious, is that the whole story?
Well,
Did everyone experience industrialization as this, like, triumphant march forward?
that's a great question. And I think it's easy to get caught up in that narrative of progress, right?
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that industrialization wasn't just about these shiny new machines.
Yeah.
It brought about massive social and economic shifts,
Yeah.
and the lives of everyday workers were completely transformed.
Okay, so let's go back to before those giant factories, like, dominated the landscape.
Okay.
What was happening before the Industrial Revolution?
Right. So before the rise of factories, was it just a world of like small workshops and artisans?
I feel like that's often the picture we have in our minds.
Right, but not quite. There was actually this fascinating period historians call proto-industrialization.
Okay, proto-industrialization.
And this actually involved large-scale production, but it took place in the countryside, not in urban centers.
Interesting. So not in those big cities we usually associate with factories.
Exactly. So merchants in 17th and 18th century Europe,
Okay.
they were looking for ways to kind of sidestep the powerful guilds in the towns, you know?
The guilds?
Yeah, those craft guilds that controlled a lot of production.
Okay.
So these merchants, they started moving their operations to rural areas.
So they were looking for more freedom,
Yeah.
basically.
Exactly. More freedom and also cheaper labor.
Makes sense.
Right. And so what was the appeal of the countryside for these merchants?
Good question.
Well, opportunity, I guess, and maybe a little bit of exploitation too.
How so?
Well, a lot of peasants at the time were losing access to common lands because of enclosure.
Enclosure.
Yeah, imagine, like, your family farm depends on shared grazing land, and suddenly, boom, it's fenced off, privatized.
Wow, that's got to be tough.
It was. People were forced to find new ways to survive.
So these merchants took advantage of that situation.
In a way, yes. They provided capital, materials, and market to these rural communities.
Okay.
So peasants, often whole families, would work from their homes producing goods for these merchants.
So it was a way for both sides to adapt, I guess, to these changing economic conditions.
That's one way to look at it.
I remember learning about how weaving, for example, became a key part of this system, right?
Exactly.
Families could earn extra income by weaving for these merchants.
Yeah, weaving, especially in England, became super important. It was a way for rural families to just make ends meet.
So we have this network of rural production.
Right.
How do we go from that to these massive factories?
Okay, so that's a great question. It was a gradual process driven by a bunch of different factors.
Okay.
But let's take the English cotton industry as a case study.
Sounds good.
So around the 1730s, you start to see factories popping up.
Okay.
And a big driver of this was new inventions.
Like what?
Think about the spinning jenny, which could spin multiple threads at once.
Oh, yeah, I remember learning about that. It revolutionized textile production, didn't it?
It was a game changer.
But was it a good thing for everyone?
Well, that's the thing, right?
I mean, didn't the spinning jenny lead to job displacement?
You're exactly right.
Weren't those women who used to hand spin yarn suddenly out of work?
Absolutely. And that's a classic example of how technological advancements can create winners and losers, right?
Totally.
Some women, they literally saw their skills become obsolete overnight. It led to a lot of anxiety, anger, even riots.
Seriously.
Oh, yeah. I actually came across this account of a magistrate being called to protect a factory.
Protected from what?
From angry workers. They were terrified that the spinning jenny was going to take away their livelihoods.
That's intense.
It was a really tumultuous time.
I can only imagine. So you would think that with these machines pumping out goods, like hand production would just vanish.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But that's actually where it gets really interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
So even in 19th century Britain, hand labor was still incredibly important.
Really?
Yeah. And now, this might seem counterintuitive, but A lot of industrialists actually preferred hand production.
Preferred it. Why?
Well, especially for specialized goods, it often made more sense.
I guess if you have a large pool of cheap labor available.
Exactly.
So it's just about cost.
Well, cost was a big factor, of course.
But wasn't there also, like, a cultural element to this?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, I feel like the upper classes, they saw handmade items as, like, a sign of refinement and luxury.
You're right on the money.
And machine-made products were considered, well, kind of less desirable.
Yeah, there was definitely a stigma attached to mass-produced goods.
It's funny how those perceptions of value play into the whole dynamic.
Totally.
But I'm guessing for the workers themselves, it was a very different story.
Oh, for sure.
Like, their lives were often pretty rough, weren't they?
Yeah. Uncertainty, hardship, that was the reality for a lot of workers.
I remember reading about Will Thorne, who walked all the way to London looking for work.
Wow.
He faced hunger, uncertainty, never knowing when or where he might find employment.
And for a lot of workers, it wasn't just about wages either, right?
That's
Like the number of work days was critical. There was this constant fear of not having enough.
It makes you realize how precarious their lives really were.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a European phenomenon either.
Right. So let's talk about how industrialization played out in other parts of the world. Like India, for example.
Okay.
It's easy to forget that before British dominance, India was a major player in the global textile trade.
That's right. Those Indian cottons were highly sought after.
And those bustling ports,
Yes.
like Surat and Hooghly, with Armenian and Persian merchants, transporting textiles across mountains and deserts.
Amazing, isn't
It's
it?
a whole world we often forget about.
Yeah, India had this vibrant network of trade and craftsmanship.
But then the East India Company shows up, and everything changes.
Yeah. The company's arrival definitely reshaped the landscape.
And I'm guessing it wasn't a change for the better for a lot of Indian artisans and merchants.
Unfortunately, no. The company's growing power really shifted those dynamics of trade.
So what happened?
Well, they secured monopolies, established new ports like Bombay and Calcutta,
Right.
and really tightened their grip on local production.
And what about those once thriving ports, like Surat and Hooghly?
As the company exerted its influence, those older ports declined.
They just couldn't compete.
It was hard to compete with those new centers of power that the British had established.
It must have been devastating for those Indian weavers and merchants who were once so successful.
It was a major blow. And of course there was resistance.
There was.
Oh, absolutely. People fought back against this encroachment.
But they were up against a pretty formidable force, weren't they?
Yeah, it was a classic David and Goliath scenario, unfortunately.
And so, by the 19th century, British-made textiles are flooding the Indian market,
Right.
undercutting local production, basically changing the whole economic reality.
It was a huge shift. I remember reading this quote from a British official in Patna.
What did you say?
He said, "Local manufacturers simply cannot compete with the cheap and durable goods from Manchester."
Wow. Talk about adding insult to injury.
Yeah, it really captures that feeling of inevitability that the British projected,
So did Indian textile production just completely vanish?
Well, not entirely. When factories started popping up in India in the mid-19th century, early Indian industrialists often focused on yarn production.
Okay, why yarn?
Well, think about it strategically. They were avoiding direct competition with those British imports.
Ah, clever. Find a niche, a way to operate within this new system.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to look at who these early industrialists were.
Yeah, tell me about them.
They came from all these different backgrounds, reflecting India's incredibly complex social and economic fabric.
So it wasn't just like one group or class of people driving this change.
Not at all. And many of them had this amazing ability to adapt and innovate.
What do you mean?
While some, like Dwarkanath Tagore, they had already made fortunes in the China trade before turning their attention to industry.
Wow, so they were already savvy business people.
Yeah, they had that entrepreneurial spirit.
And others.
Well, you had the Parsis in Bombay.
Okay.
They had accumulated wealth through trade and raw cotton exports.
So they were leveraging their existing expertise
Yeah.
to enter this new world of factories.
Exactly. And it shows that they weren't just reacting to the British presence. They were actively shaping the future of Indian industry in their own way.
It's inspiring to see that kind of agency, even amidst all those challenges.
It is. But, we've been focusing a lot on these large-scale shifts.
Yeah,
What about those small-scale industries, those handcrafts? Did they just disappear?
good question.
So while factories were expanding, they were still just a small part of the overall Indian economy.
Okay.
Small-scale production continued to thrive, often in those little workshops, home-based units, tucked away in the back alleys of cities.
So it was this coexistence of modern factories and traditional methods of production.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating dynamic.
And it wasn't just a matter of survival for those small-scale producers, was it?
Right. In some cases, these handicraft industries actually expanded in the 20th century.
Really? Like what?
We'll take handloom weaving, for example.
A handloom weaving. But didn't we say that was being decimated by those cheap Manchester imports?
Well, yes and no. The spinning industry definitely took a hit, but handloom weavers, they were incredibly adaptable.
Okay, how so?
They embraced innovations like the fly shuttle.
So they weren't just stuck in the past.
Not at all. They were finding ways to increase their productivity, to compete more effectively.
So technology wasn't always the enemy of traditional crafts.
No, not at all. Sometimes it could be a tool for survival, even growth.
I love that.
And these craftspeople, they produced goods that had this unique quality and cultural significance.
Yeah.
Think about those intricately woven saris, the lunges and handkerchiefs of Madras.
They were more than just commodities, weren't they?
Exactly. They held cultural meaning. They had this artistry that machines just couldn't replicate.
Right.
So even as factories proliferated, there was still this space for those handcrafted goods,
Right.
for that skill that was passed down through generations.
That's right. It speaks to that enduring power of craftsmanship and cultural identity.
Totally. But let's be honest, even with all those adaptations, life for those weavers and craftspeople was still pretty tough, wasn't it? It certainly was. They often faced really long hours, difficult conditions, and often whole families were involved in the production process.
That's to make ends meet.
Just to survive.
It reminds you that the story of industrialization isn't always one of progress and triumph.
Yeah,
It's often one of hardship and struggle, especially for those at the bottom.
absolutely.
But they persevered, they adapted, they innovated.
It did.
It's a testament to their resilience, their ingenuity.
It really is. And it challenges that simplistic notion of industrialization as this straight line of progress.
Right. It was way more nuanced and complex than that.
Way more. There were winners and losers, innovations and disruptions.
And this constant interplay between the old and the new.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about production either, right?
Sure.
It was also about consumption.
Ah.
How did industrialists, both British and Indian, convince people to buy all these new goods?
That's a great question. Like, it's one thing to make stuff, but you have to make people want it
Exactly.
to believe they need it.
That's where the fascinating world of advertising comes in.
Ooh, yes. I'm excited to dive into that.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just produce. You got to persuade.
You got to market it. You got to create desire.
We've covered so much ground already, but I'm ready for more.
Me too.
Let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back to delve into that art of persuasion and the birth of modern advertising.
Welcome back. So we've been talking about how industrialization wasn't this one-size-fits-all phenomenon, right?
Totally. Each region had its own unique experience, its own challenges and opportunities.
Exactly. So let's go back to India for a moment. We're talking about those challenges Indian weavers faced as British textiles flooded the market.
Right, like how do you compete with that?
Exactly. But how did industrialization unfold within India itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. Was it just about copying what was happening in Manchester?
It's interesting, right? Because it really gets to the heart of how India navigated this era of global economic change.
I'm all ears.
So remember how we talked about Indian factories initially focusing on yarn production?
Right, to avoid that head-to-head competition.
Exactly. But as we move into the early 20th century, things start to shift.
Okay, what happened?
Well, a few things, actually. The Swadeshi movement was gaining momentum at the time.
The Swadeshi movement.
Yeah, it was this movement urging Indians to boycott foreign goods and embrace local products.
So like a buy local campaign, but with a much deeper political and cultural significance.
Exactly. It tapped into this powerful sense of national identity and collective action.
So you had this surge in demand for Indian-made goods.
Exactly. And alongside that, industrial groups were actively lobbying the government for protectionist policies.
So things like tariffs to protect domestic industries.
Exactly. They were trying to create a more favorable environment for Indian businesses.
Okay, that makes sense. So you have this growing nationalist sentiment, these calls for economic self-reliance,
Right.
and then World War I breaks out.
Boom! Another curveball.
How did that impact India?
Well, with Britain's factories suddenly focused on war production, Those Manchester imports to India dried up.
Oh, wow. So it was like an unintended consequence of the war.
Totally. And suddenly, Indian mills had this captive market.
A moment of opportunity.
Absolutely.
So did they rise to the occasion?
They did. Indian factories were churning out everything, from jute bags and army uniforms to tents and leather boots.
Wow. They really stepped up.
It was a boom time for industrial production.
Yeah.
It proved that they could meet those demands, that they could compete on a global scale.
That's amazing. So the war, in a way, forced this shift in the balance of power,
I think that's a great way to put it.
allowed Indian industries to gain a stronger foothold.
Exactly. And after the war, Manchester tried to reclaim its dominance, but it was never quite the same.
The landscape had changed,
It had. Indian industries had tasted success. They'd proven themselves.
and they continued to grow and diversify, right?
They did. The war had accelerated this process that was already underway.
Fascinating how these historical events can have these, like, ripple effects that no one could have predicted.
History's full of surprises. But, as we talk about all these factories and mass production,
Yeah.
what happened to those small-scale industries we talked about earlier?
Right. Those workshops, those home-based units.
Did they manage to coexist? Or were they just pushed out?
Good question.
It's a really interesting dynamic because while factories were expanding, they still represented just a fraction of the Indian economy.
It's okay.
Small-scale production continued to flourish.
So it was a mixed bag, I guess, with both modern factories and traditional crafts playing a role.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about clinging to old ways either.
Right, like they were innovating too, weren't they?
In some cases, those handicraft industries actually grew during the 20th century.
Really?
Yeah, like handloom weaving, for example.
But didn't we talk about how handloom weaving was struggling?
Well, the spinning industry took a major hit, that's true.
Okay.
But handloom weavers, they were really adaptable.
So?
They embraced innovations like the fly shuttle.
Right, which increased their productivity.
Exactly. They were able to compete more effectively.
So technology wasn't always the enemy of these traditional crafts.
Not at all. Sometimes it could be a tool for survival, even growth.
That's so cool.
And these craftspeople, they were producing goods that had this special quality, this cultural significance.
Right, they weren't just churning out generic products.
Exactly. Think about those intricately woven saris,
Yeah.
the lunges and handkerchiefs of Madras.
They were works of art almost.
They were, and they had a meaning, a history that you couldn't get from mass-produced goods.
So even as factories grew, there was still a demand for those handcrafted items, for that connection to tradition.
Absolutely. It speaks to the enduring power of craftsmanship, of cultural identity.
I love that. But even with all those adaptations, it couldn't have been easy for those artisans and craftspeople.
It wasn't. They often faced long hours, difficult working conditions.
And it wasn't just individual artisans either, was it?
Right. Often whole families were involved in the production process.
Just to make ends meet.
It's a reminder that the story of industrialization, it's not always this rosy picture of progress. There's often a lot of hardship and struggle behind it, especially for those at the bottom.
It's so important to remember that.
It is. But even in the face of these challenges, they persevered, they adapted, they found ways to make it work.
It's a testament to their resilience, their creativity.
Absolutely. And it challenges our assumptions about how progress happens.
It's not always a straight line, is it?
Not at all. It's messy, it's complicated, it's full of contradictions.
Totally. But we've been focusing a lot on the workers.
Yeah.
What about the people driving all this industrial growth?
Oh, the entrepreneurs.
Yeah. What were their stories like?
That's a great question, because they often get overlooked in the grand narratives of industrialization, right?
Totally. But they played such a crucial role.
They did, both in Europe and in places like India.
And I imagine they face their own set of challenges, right?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't always a smooth ride for them either.
What were some of the biggest hurdles they faced?
Well, imagine being an Indian entrepreneur in the late 19th or early 20th century.
Okay.
You're trying to build a business in a system that's heavily biased towards British interests.
Right.
You're competing with established British firms that have access to cheaper capital, better technology, and often, preferential treatment from the colonial government.
Talk about an uphill battle.
It was a David and Goliath situation for sure.
So how did they manage to succeed?
Well, they had to be incredibly resourceful, incredibly innovative.
Like what?
Well, simply copying the British model wouldn't work, right?
Okay.
They had to adapt to the specific conditions of the Indian market, leverage their own strengths.
Give me some examples.
Okay, so take the Tata Group, for instance.
Okay, one of India's biggest industrial empires.
Exactly. They started out in the cotton textile industry,
Right.
but they quickly realized they couldn't compete head-on with those British mills.
What do they do?
They diversified. They went into steel production, hydroelectric power generation.
Wow.
They even established India's first airline.
They weren't messing around.
They were constantly looking for new opportunities, willing to take risks.
It's amazing how they transformed challenges into opportunities for growth.
Right. And they weren't alone. A lot of Indian entrepreneurs found success by focusing on niche markets,
Okay.
utilizing local knowledge and resources, building strong relationships with Indian consumers.
So it's about finding those gaps in the market, tailoring their businesses to specific needs.
Exactly. It was a combination of business acumen, understanding the local context, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
And it wasn't just about individual brilliance either, was it?
Right. Let's not forget the role of community networks, those support systems.
You're right, like family connections, caste ties, those regional affiliations.
Exactly. They provided access to capital, they helped secure contracts, they helped navigate that whole complex world of business.
It's a reminder that entrepreneurship isn't just about individual genius. It's about collaboration, about trust, about a shared vision.
Totally. But let's not forget that these entrepreneurs were also operating within this larger political and economic context.
Right, like how did government policies impact their success?
That's a huge factor. In the case of India, colonial policies often created all these obstacles for Indian entrepreneurs.
Like what?
Well, they faced discriminatory regulations, they had limited access to credit, and they were frequently excluded from those big, lucrative government contracts.
So they were constantly having to overcome these systemic barriers.
Yeah, they were swimming against the tide in a lot of ways.
But despite all that, they persevered.
They did, and their achievements are a testament to their resilience, their determination.
Their stories are incredibly inspiring.
They are, and they offer valuable lessons for anyone trying to build something new, It's about overcoming obstacles, about navigating complex systems.
Totally. It's not always easy, but it's definitely possible.
That's right. But let's shift gears a bit now.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the big picture, about the entrepreneurs, about the workers.
Right.
But what was it actually like to work in a factory during this era?
Yeah, let's get down to the nitty-gritty.
Like, what was that day-to-day reality?
Right. We talk about industrial progress, but what about the lived experience?
Exactly. So imagine this. You're a factory worker in the late 19th or early 20th century.
Okay.
You're living in this crowded industrial city, probably covered in smog.
Not the most glamorous picture.
Yeah, and you're working 12, maybe even 14 hours a day, 6 days a week.
No weekends off.
Leisure time was a luxury for very few workers during this era.
Wow.
And the work itself, it was often monotonous, physically demanding, and sometimes, downright dangerous.
Dangerous.
Yeah, safety regulations were pretty minimal back then, so accidents were unfortunately quite common.
Yikes.
And think about the noise, the heat, the poor ventilation.
Doesn't sound very pleasant.
It wasn't. And I doubt the factory owners were toiling away alongside their workers.
Right. Right. What was their perspective on all this?
Well, for them, it was all about efficiency, about maximizing profits.
The bottom line.
Exactly. They were constantly looking for ways to increase productivity, cut costs, stay ahead of the competition.
So it was this constant balancing act.
It was. Keep the workers productive enough to meet demand, but also make sure the business is profitable.
Makes sense.
And let's not forget the social and cultural dynamics at play within these factories.
Right. Like it wasn't just about the work itself, was it?
No. These factories often brought together people from all these different backgrounds.
So they were creating new communities.
They were, but also sometimes tensions, conflicts.
I can imagine.
You had this influx of people from rural areas into the cities. So it was like this microcosm of all these larger social transformations happening at the time.
So as these factories got bigger and more complex, did new systems of management emerge?
Definitely. Think about the rise of the foreman, for example.
The foreman.
Yeah, he acted as this intermediary between the workers and the management. He was responsible for maintaining discipline, setting production targets, resolving disputes.
Sounds like a tough job.
It was caught between the demands of the bosses and the needs of the workers.
Right. Pressure from both sides.
It was a role full of challenges for sure.
It's a reminder that industrialization wasn't just about machines and technology.
Right.
It was also about these human relationships, these power dynamics.
Exactly. And speaking of workers, what about their wages? Their working conditions?
Right, like were things ever improving?
Well, that's a complicated story.
Okay.
The struggle for better working conditions, it was a long and often difficult journey, you know?
Led by labor unions, social reformers.
Yeah, and sometimes even sympathetic factory owners.
So there were people fighting for change.
Absolutely. And those stories of resilience, of collective action, they're really inspiring.
It's a reminder that the history of industrialization is ultimately a human story, a
Absolutely.
story of progress, but also of struggle.
Well said. And it's a story that still resonates today, right? As we deal with the legacies of industrialization and globalization.
Totally. But before we get into those modern-day connections, let's explore another really interesting part of this whole story. The marketing strategies used to create those consumer cultures we talked about.
Ah, yes. The art of persuasion.
Right. It's one thing to produce all these goods, but you got to get people to buy them.
Exactly. You have to create desire, shape perception.
That's where advertising comes in. And I'm so curious to hear how they did that in a time before radio, television, the internet.
It was a whole different ballgame back then.
They had to be really creative, didn't they?
They did. Think back to those early labels on Manchester textiles we talked about.
Right. The images of Indian gods and goddesses.
Exactly. They were tapping into existing cultural beliefs, creating a sense of familiarity.
It's like, hey, if the gods approve of this product, it must be good.
Right. And those labels, they weren't just strategically designed. They were often visually stunning, too.
Like little works of art.
They were. They understood the power of visual appeal. They wanted those labels to stand out on the shelf.
It's a reminder that advertising isn't just about words. It's about creating a feeling, an emotion.
You're right. It's about aspiration, belonging, all those things.
Totally. And they also tapped into those bigger cultural narratives, those anxieties that were shaping society.
They did.
Give me an example.
Okay, so think about the rise of soap advertising.
Soap.
Yeah. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries,
Okay.
they weren't just selling soap, They were selling cleanliness, hygiene, modernity.
So they tied their product to these desirable qualities.
Exactly. Use our soap, be a part of the modern world.
Clever.
And they weren't afraid to play on people's fears either.
Like what?
You'd see these ads with images of dirty, unhealthy people next to those who used the advertised soap, who were clean, healthy, successful.
Create a problem. Present your product as the solution.
It's a classic tactic.
And it's amazing how many of those early techniques are still used today.
That's right. It speaks to those fundamental principles of human psychology, of persuasion.
We haven't changed that much, have we?
I guess not. But of course, as new technologies emerged, the ways people advertised changed too.
Right. From newspapers and magazines to radio, television, the internet.
Each new medium brought new possibilities, new challenges.
And today, with social media, it's all about those viral campaigns, engaging with consumers directly.
Right. Building online communities around your brand.
It's a constantly evolving landscape.
It is. But those core principles, that understanding of human psychology, that remains the same.
It's still about knowing your audience, crafting a message that resonates.
And finding creative ways to reach them. And it makes you realize that advertising is more than just a business,
Yeah.
It's a reflection of our culture, our values, our desires.
That's powerful.
It is. And in a way, it's an art form, too.
We've covered a lot of ground today. From those early factories to the marketing strategies used to sell the goods they produced.
It's been quite a journey.
It's amazing to see how all these pieces fit together,
It is. And it shows how industrialization wasn't just this isolated event. It was this complex process that shaped everything.
Our economies, our societies, our cultures.
Our relationship with technology, our relationship with each other.
As we navigate our own rapidly changing world, I think there's a lot we can learn from studying the past, both the good and the bad.
Absolutely. By understanding how we got here, we can make better choices for the future.
I love that. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Welcome back. We've been on this incredible journey through the history of industrialization.
We have, from those early factories to the impact on workers.
To the rise of these, entrepreneurial empires.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride.
It has. But now it's time to dive into one of my favorite parts of this whole story. The birth of modern advertising.
Ah, yes. The art of persuasion.
Because you can have the most amazing product in the world.
Right.
But if people don't know about it, if they don't want it,
Yeah.
it's not going to succeed.
It's all about marketing, creating that desire.
And I'm so fascinated by how they approached advertising in a time before radio, television, the internet.
It's a whole different world, isn't it?
Totally. Like, what were their tools? How did they get their message out there?
They had to be incredibly creative. Think back to those early labels on Manchester textiles we talked about.
Oh, right. With the images of Indian gods and goddesses.
Exactly. They were tapping into existing cultural beliefs and associations.
It was brilliant.
It was. It wasn't just branding. It was about creating a sense of familiarity, of trust.
Like, hey, if the gods approve of this product, it must be good.
Exactly. And those labels, they weren't just strategically designed. They were often visually stunning, too.
They were like little works of art.
They were. Intricate details, vibrant colors. They understood that visual appeal was just as important as the message itself.
They wanted to catch your eye.
Absolutely. Stand out on that crowded shelf.
It's a reminder that advertising has always been about more than just words.
It's about emotion.
Yeah. Creating a feeling, a connection, a sense of aspiration, maybe?
You're right on the money. And it wasn't just about individual desires either.
What do you mean?
They tapped into those larger cultural narratives, those anxieties that were shaping society.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so think about the rise of soap advertising in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Soap.
Yeah. It wasn't just about selling soap, It was about selling cleanliness, hygiene, modernity.
Associating your product with those desirable qualities.
Exactly. Use our soap. Become a part of this new modern world.
I see. And didn't they also play on people's fears a bit?
Oh, for sure. You'd see those ads with images of dirty, unhealthy individuals, and then right next to them, people who use the advertised soap.
Clean, healthy, successful.
Exactly. Create a problem, present your product as the solution.
Classic marketing. And it's amazing how many of those early techniques are still used today.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It speaks to those fundamental principles of human psychology, of persuasion.
I guess we haven't changed that much. But as new technologies emerged, advertising had to adapt, right?
Of course. Newspapers, magazines, then radio, television, and now the internet.
A whole new set of tools.
Each one brings its own possibilities, its own challenges.
And today, with social media, it's a whole other ballgame.
It is. It's about viral campaigns, engaging directly with consumers, building online communities.
A constantly evolving landscape.
It is. But like you said, those core principles of persuasion, that understanding of what makes people tick.
Those haven't changed.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. Advertising, it's more than just a business.
That's a reflection of our culture, our values.
Our fears, our aspirations.
Wow, we've come full circle, haven't we?
We have, from the rise of factories to the ways those goods were marketed and consumed.
It's all connected.
It is, and it shows how industrialization, it wasn't just this one event, it was this force that transformed everything.
It's still shaping our world today.
In so many ways.
Yeah.
As we navigate our own rapidly changing world, I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn from the past.
Both the good and the bad.
Exactly. By understanding how we got here, we can make better choices for the future.
I love that. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the history of industrialization.